This is Kareem from Open Source Defense, and I am here with Jon and Sarah Hauptman of PHLster Holsters. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
So you run a holster company. Sarah, you started out in medical imaging and photography and videography. Jon, you have a fine arts degree and worked in auto repair. Why holsters?
Well, that story arc is a kind of a happy accident. So I had gone to art school and I graduated and said, boy, do I need a real job. And I started fixing cars. And that went on for a number of years. And I was living in Philadelphia at the time. And I had gotten reasonably decent at like engine management diagnosis and electrical repair. And I would work my day job, and over the course of working at a number of different shops and kind of doing my own thing here and there, I'd accumulated some diagnostic equipment, and I would occasionally go to a friend's shop after work or another shop after work to help them fix or diagnose something that had been a problem all day. And I worked in a pretty crappy neighborhood out in West Philly at the time, and I went after work to other crappy neighborhoods where auto repair garages are located with a considerable amount of diagnostic equipment to get paid in cash. At which point I said, "Man, I should have a gun for this. This is inevitably going to require a gun." And I had exposure to guns. The instant I turned 21, I took myself to the range, just because it was such a kind of like taboo and mysterious place in the city. Urban ranges at the time were not kind of like clean, bright, friendly, welcoming places to go. So it was a little transgressive, and that was an interesting experience. But later on, I found myself needing my own pistol, and I got one, and I started immediately taking it seriously and looking at like, okay, well, let's get training and what kind of gear is out there and how does this work? And I would, my first venture into plastic sculpting was actually, some older folks might remember this, the Toyota unintended acceleration recall, which was actually nothing to do with the cars whatsoever. It was just that anytime somebody put, like a floor mat and a carpet scrap and then their WeatherTech underneath their pedal, the pedal would get stuck. And the recall consisted of removing the pedal from the car, matching it up with a metal template, shaving it off, and smoothing it out. And so I got really good at like cutting and grinding and polishing plastic really nicely to the point where it looked like it came that way. And so I started buying holsters to go along with my training and the taking seriously of the firearms. And I said, well, I can certainly cut and grind these holsters the way I like them. I did 25 gas pedals this week. I could certainly modify this plastic pedal. Oh, interesting. It's all made out of the same plastic, et cetera, et cetera. And I started looking around for resources for how to make your own holsters. Because, when you're going through like the early phase of your enthusiast cycle in something, it's like, oh man, that'd be so cool. I want to buy one of those holsters. Oh no, the lead time is like 14 weeks. I know that I am consuming content and changing my tastes and perspective at such a rapid rate that there's a pretty low likelihood of me having the same gun 14 weeks from now as when I purchased it. I knew that I was just in that kind of like rapid information consumption cycle, and that I did not have the patience to wait 14 weeks for this. I am voraciously consuming information now. I would like instant gratification as part of that.
Sure. Who doesn't?
Yeah. So I started looking up like, okay, well, how do you form Kydex holsters? And there was like one forum post on some knife forum about it. And then everyone else was very hush-hush about how it worked. And, one of the things that I learned from being an auto mechanic was if something comes into the shop for the first time, you don't want to be the first guy to work on it, right? Oh, isn't it interesting that this, current model year car has come in with a significant engine problem? First of all, none of us have taken it apart yet. Second of all, this is a new, surprising, and mysterious problem. I'm way better off watching the guy in the bay next to me fumble through this mess than doing it myself. And I decided that in a space where there's no real information, and this was back in the kind of like earlier-ish days of YouTube, kind of like 2009, 2010, before it was really the place you went to look for absolutely everything on your first search. I said, I'm going to be the guy who screws this up in front of everybody else. And I'm just going to start recording the process of learning how to make holsters from scratch in an environment where you've got like one forum post about how to make knife sheaths and then like the technical data that Kydex thermoplastic puts out, which differs substantially from the heats and pressures that you want to use to make a holster, right? So,
well, just for context, I mean, we're talking what, like 2010, 2011 era now?
Yeah, so I started doing this in 2009, and sometime in 2010 is when the YouTube channel really started taking off, because as I learned more of this, all of a sudden all the other people who were kind of like looking up this information and trying to figuring it out on their own start getting in contact with you, and you start sharing ideas and thoughts, and oh, well, I did it this way and I got this result, and I did it this way and I got this result. And we started forming a little community. Pardon me. And at some point, the holsters were getting decent enough that other people wanted to buy them. People were like, oh, I found this YouTube channel and I was going to start this process, but I'll just buy one from you. And that went on for a period of time until one day I looked down at my phone and realized I was going to make more money answering my emails than I was turning wrenches, and I wouldn't have to stay up until 3 in the morning to get it all done. I said, okay, well, I'm going to pack up my tools and I'm going to just take a stab at seeing what happens if I turn this into a full-time business. And initially it was all like custom, everything made to order, because I didn't really have any concept of how insanely time consuming that was going to be, or how poorly it was going to scale. And I went from there, and then I had made enough holsters that I said, okay, I'm going to put together a like really comprehensive, like multi-hour 2-part video of how to actually make a whole custom holster from scratch. I think I can codify that in a kind of authoritative way that gives people repeatable results. And we did that, and now that has something like 1.5 million views or something like that over, it's over 10 years. But
what was the need? Like, what was the need, do you think, that was responding to? Is that, I mean, in that era, was, I think, like Kydex as a material, at least for holsters, was pretty new, right? Like it wasn't like there were 10 holster companies where it's like, oh, we're all making Kydex and like all the problems are solved and we're just cranking them out, right?
Well, it wasn't new. They've been making Kydex holsters forever. Bill Rogers brought that kind of forming process to Safari Land ages ago. And, Blade Tech had been doing it for a considerable amount of time. And, Kydex holsters weren't anything new. It was kind of like kind of coming off the heels of like peak War on Terror, and Magpul Dynamics videos were really big, and it was like, if you're into guns, you got to dress like a PMC and all that stuff. But people, Kydex holsters had kind of like burst onto the scene as the kind of like contemporary, up to date way of doing this, and you can get them custom made, and they have a number of advantages over leather holsters. And everybody cool that you see involved in gun culture is carrying a Kydex holster, and demand for them was through the roof. And there were a number of companies at the time that were kind of like struggling to keep up with demand. Like the one that I really wanted that was going to take like 14 weeks and cost $200. And I'm like, well, this isn't a proprietary process. It's just undisclosed. And so I want to learn this just for me. I'm sure a number of other people want to learn this too. Let's fumble through it publicly in an attempt to kind of like eventually democratize this information, because the demand is artificial. right? It's not that the process is patented or protected or proprietary or secret. It's not the 11 herbs and spices. It's like, how hot do you make this commercially available sheet of plastic, and what foam do you use to mold it around? It's just pressure forming of a particular kind of plastic, and you just need to figure out how that particular kind of plastic prefers to be pressure formed.
Yeah. Walk me through maybe like kind of key inflection points there. So that's like, okay, that's the first stage. From there to today, what were kind of the key inflection points in the company's history and product evolution?
Okay, so to skate through what's coming up on year 14 or 15 of doing this professionally, step one was going full-time making custom holsters in the spare room of my house. Phase two was growing out of that and hiring my first employee, I think around 2012, and moving into a basement industrial space in Kensington, Philadelphia. At which point we decided we were going to kind of like standardize our production around some pretty simple but unique at the time products. Because I knew that custom wasn't going to scale. And so we got our very first vacuum former and our very first CNC router, and we were turning out, they were called the Skeleton and the Access holster at the time. They were just like slim, minimalist, really, really basic products. The next major inflection point was that one of the people I had met in the early days, Andrew Henry, whose background is in violin making, actually had started his own holster company, and he had an amazing, efficient process. And my process was not amazing and efficient, but we had really high demand. And I was sort of getting into a point where I'm like, I can't keep up with demand and repair my process and develop new product. But he has capacity and an amazing process, and I have demand. Let's start getting a significant portion of our work done at his location. And then I would finish them up and retail them. And then from there, we went to a model where we had 100% of the product made at his location and then fulfilled to a third-party pick, pack, and ship spot to be fulfilled onto the customer through the website. And a couple years into that, I moved to Minnesota to be with Sarah. And I had brought with me at the time a product that was under development. And Jules from Runcible Works and I had been working on essentially like a whole bunch of DFM to take his Runcible Works YP belt holster integrated product into something that didn't have to be like bespoke, hand sewn, made to order. And it's like, what if we could scale this up into something that fit multiple different holsters that people already had and fulfilled all of these requirements? Like, what if we, let's just see if we can get there. And he and I had been working on that for about a year, at which point Sarah, who had been doing a lot of like product photography and videography for me because of the drone business and photo video editing business that she had, in addition to being a medical imaging full-time, saw some of the materials that we were working with, picked them up and said, hey, can I try something with this? And I said, sure. And she came back with the first draft of the Enigma that we now know today. And Jules and I looked at that and said, boy, did we waste a year and a half working on this. And so we finished up took Sarah's idea, did all the rest of the DFM for it. And that was released right around the time of the pandemics and the riots, at which point we started to get really busy. Sarah didn't want to go downtown and work at a hospital from which she could watch the city burn anymore. And I said, your time is way more valuable if you spend it with me, and I don't have to have a rescue plan for you every day.
Right.
And from there, the next inflection point was that instead of having that manufactured to a third party and fulfilled to a third party, pick, pack, and ship, plus Andrew's products, Andrew's generated products being fulfilled to that pick, pack, and ship, we brought everything in house to Andrew's facility, where there's manufacturing and fulfillment all on site, so we can keep that loop really short, and way more efficient. So that's where we are now. We went through like a considerable amount of figuring out how we were going to outsource it, and we outgrew various vendors along the way, and Andrew's been keep up with us really well.
Yeah, so John's a genius when it comes to like visualizing a design and like having every detail of it perfect in his mind, and he just like puts it on a piece of paper and it works. And Andrew is a genius where he will walk into a shop and he'll just kind of like look around, and it's like the the meme with all the numbers and the and you can just see his mind working, and you come back like a week later and he's got everything like moved around to a different spot. Everything's more efficient. And all of a sudden this same space is putting out like 20 times more product. That's Andrew's genius.
Yeah.
And
he can like quantifiably improve the efficiency of a production space by like moving the trash cans 2 feet.
Right.
Like
yeah.
that kind of like absolute like lean maniac.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, and I don't know how he turns it off. Like, I don't know how I don't know how he doesn't go home and like rearrange the cupboard to make the breakfast more efficient. I don't know, but he's an absolute genius. So for us, like being able to kind of insource everything at Andrew's meant that now not only are we getting everything done under one roof, but we now our shipping errors have gone down to like practically zero. And his shipping process is incredibly efficient. Like they ship almost everything within 20 minutes of ordering it. So they've done an amazing job. So that was a huge tipping point for our business as well.
Yeah, it's way more efficient now.
There's a ton I want to dive into there. I'm just jumping back to the creation of the Enigma, Sarah. I'm curious, like it's so different. And I have 2 of them. I love them. Like, it's great. It's so different. It's one of those things where I could imagine you have this idea and there's so much that needs to happen in terms of like iteration and tweaking it and figuring out like, okay, let's use the Tegris here, but not here. And let's cut these holes in it. And the strap needs to be this wide. And what, like, all of that needs to happen between when you have the idea and when you know that it's actually like any good, right?
Yeah.
I am. What was that process like? Like, how soon after you had the idea did you know, like, okay, this does not suck. This has legs.
Oh man, that's a really good question. So we're still going through that process. Like we never stopped. But I think I got to the point where I made the first kind of like boomerang shaped Tegris faceplate and bolted a holster onto it. And I put it on and I put just like a little bit of pressure on the belt and it disappeared. And I went, John, come and look at this. And I was like, I knew at that point, I was like, this is going to be cool. We never really thought it was going to be like huge and viral at that time. So that was a surprise, but we knew it was going to work at that point. And then from there, we tested like every iteration that we could think of. Like, how can we make this better? What can we do differently? And we settled on kind of like a working prototype that was possible to mass produce with the materials and the resources that we had at the time. And there's no way we thought of everything. There's always something you didn't think of, but I for years I thought like, oh man, it sure is funny. A lot of times you'll hand that product to a person and they'll put it on and they'll be like, oh yeah, okay, this is cool, but why, what, have you tried doing this or that? And I'm like, yeah, we tried that 3 years ago. It worked pretty good, but we couldn't do it because of this, or like it didn't work because of this. It's like we spent so much time iterating that I feel like we kind of we probably overdid it. But it's valuable because every time you go through that process, it like just reinforces your learning, and it kind of makes you think in a kind of like generative way, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, this is something I've written about a bunch in the OSD newsletter, that, like oversimplifying two kind of general theories of innovation or when products come along. One is this idea that, like, okay, there's just someone comes up with an idea and that someone hasn't thought of before and does it, and like, great, it works. The other is this idea that things kind of get invented about as soon as it's possible for them to be invented.
Mm-hmm.
So like you can look at like YouTube as an example I like, where tons of people tried to build YouTube before YouTube, but broadband internet wasn't really as much of a thing. You had to install plugins to play video on your computer. Phones came around, like smartphones came around 2 years after YouTube. So there were all these pieces where in retrospect you can say like, okay, you couldn't really have built it before these things existed. And then pretty much as soon as they all existed, you see like, okay, cool, YouTube now exists. I think that's a little bit oversimplified in that, like, you can point to examples of products that like, well, like there's no real reason this couldn't have existed 10 times or 10 years sooner, but just nobody thought of it. Where do you think the Enigma falls into that? Like, could someone have done this 10 years ago or 15 years ago and you just thought of it? Or was it like, okay, well, Tegris wasn't a thing, or like what were kind of the key pieces?
I think Tegris was a tipping point for us, because so when we were prototyping this, before we even thought of using Tegris, we used every other material that we could find and think of, and we're like, it just doesn't work great. It's not great. It's not amazing.
If I can interject.
You can.
It doesn't have to be Tegris.
No.
It doesn't have to be Tegris. However, what Tegris did, I mean, and in fact, there are certainly better materials than Tegris. And, I'm not going to spill the beans by saying that we're looking into that. However, it was the availability of Tegris combined with the availability of just like the proliferation of at-home laser cutting.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a great material for prototyping. Other stuff, like we couldn't make it out of Kydex because for it to be that thin and that flexible, it would also be fragile. Leather wouldn't be the right thing because for it to have that amount of support, it would have to be significantly thicker than Tegris. So we were able to get our hands on a material that had exactly the sweet spot of flexibility and rigidity, combined with the fact that we can rapid prototype it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the rapid prototyping eliminated a lot of the financial risk associated with the product development, meaning we could really dig into this deeply and do a lot of iterations at a super low cost as a really small company. Right. Which meant that we had essentially unlimited experimental R&D budget for this project, because we didn't have to, as a tiny company, spend tens of thousands of dollars on an injection mold and then years and, months and months and months leading up to a year to find like exactly the right material and do all the testing and put it out into the world. We can laser cut a piece of Tegris, slap it on a holster, hand it to somebody and say, go figure out how to break this several times a week. So that's all that, and that encounters a moment in time where appendix carry isn't new anymore, and there is some minimum necessary understanding in the market for it to seem like an obvious solution to the, minimum viable customer. Like the minimum viable customer for this now exists in greater numbers than it would have 10 years ago. And so that gave us an into the market. And we were also able to generate a lot of design iterations in a short period of time as a small company.
Yeah, buying that Glowforge was like game changer for us. That was allowed us to do a lot of things. So yeah, I would agree with all of that. We did, when we were originally prototyping this, we did try like just about everything else we could get our hands on. And it really was that combination of the rapid prototyping, but the rigidity of Tigris, along with the like tensile strength of it. It was really the only thing at the time that we could get our hands on that was capable of doing that.
Additionally, it was starting to have a lot of uptake in other areas of the tactical equipment space, as well as a number of other kind of like outdoorsy and manufacturing stuff.
Right.
So it allowed us to go to other vendors and say, hey, I see that you're working with this particular material. We have a design that uses that. You've got institutional knowledge about exactly how to laser cut it properly, which means that we can jump right into production at scale with a third party who has, tactical soft goods experience.
Yeah. Why do you think people aren't using it more? Or are they? But I don't see.
They use it a lot.
Yeah.
I mean for holsters or carry chassis in general, like I don't see a ton. I mean, maybe I'm sure you know more than me about this, but I don't see a ton of people being like, okay, we're completely retooling to move away from on-belt carry and we're gonna go copy the Enigma.
Probably because of the utility patents, but
yeah.
but yeah, there was like kind of, I think it's kind of fading, but there was a brief explosion in Tigris after like not just because of us, but a number of companies in the self-defense outdoorsy space started doing it, and it also looks really cool. So we saw it on Instagram a lot, and then everyone else was like, where can I get some of that? And I think for most products in that space, it doesn't do anything better than existing materials. And it probably does some things worse. So like you wouldn't, for example, try to like form a holster out of it because it just doesn't do those things well. But you do see it, like I've seen it a lot in like belts, stuff like that, just kind of added as structural components. And things like what do you call it? It's like a pocket shield for your backpack.
Yeah.
It's like a structural panel in a backpack where you can just like
attach
stuff. Or like mag carriers. Or that sort of thing.
Yeah, and it really makes a lot of sense in those applications. But then also like when the pandemic really hit, and things started kind of changing, and starting with like supply chains, and then also like different global conflicts, the supply chain for Tigris got really tight, and the quality went down. So I think that's probably a factor in why you don't see it more, and why some companies are moving away from it.
Yeah, there's a lot of variability within batches. There's, occasionally somewhat higher scrap rate than you really want to deal with in manufacturing.
Yeah, delamination, stuff like that. Like we almost never saw delamination pre-pandemic.
Yeah, like we occasionally went through phases where number of warranty claims related to Enigma kind of goes up and down. And the interesting thing is that none of that occurred before the demand spiked for that material. Mm-hmm. Right? So first year of Enigma sales, warranty claims were next to zero. Year two, we were seeing stuff like occasionally somebody would make a warranty claim within 90 days of ownership, which never happened in the previous year. And that indicates to us some material property that we can't control. So
Yeah.
there's some of that to deal with. I think a lot of additionally, there's a lot to know about it. So, for instance, folks in like the tactical soft goods industry will go, "Oh yeah, we're going to throw Tegris in this thing too," and they just sew it like they sew everything else, not realizing that they're creating essentially perforations in it. And they go, "Oh well, our Tegris failure rate's really high. This stuff sucks. Nobody wants it." It's when, in fact, if you had more sensitive material handling built into the manufacturing process, you wouldn't have certain kinds of failures. So
yeah,
it looks trendy in some cases. People jump into using the material without a lot of prerequisite knowledge and then fail to get the results that other people want, that they see other people having. And
yeah, it does kind of run down the reputation of the material in the market.
Yeah. When I think of PHLster generally, I think of this combination of kind of tinkering with new materials, but also like a very systematic approach. And you see that in kind of the education you guys do, and like, poke and check and peaks and valleys, and just bringing a level of legibility to a process that previously seemed like, oh, okay, you do this and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but we don't really know why. In kind of on the product development side there, guns are kind of a cottage industry. This is what we see like when investing in companies in the space and talking to people. It's a pretty small industry. And I think, John, when you were talking about, okay, with starting the company and just getting basic information out there about how to form kydex and all that, I'm curious how you've seen that evolve, like as, specifically the holster market has matured. You've gone through this cycle of going from very much kind of a garage business to like a really serious business, and then with Enigma kind of starting over, not as a company but as on the kind of product development life cycle of, okay, now we're back like tinkering with this new concept, new materials, and democratizing that. I'm curious, like, how have you seen that evolve in the holster space? Like, could someone start a holster company today, or in the same way you did 14 years ago? Or is it kind of like, well, like that's pretty mature now, and the new thing somebody starts will be something else?
It's different. It's a little bit like starting a YouTube channel today. You can still do it and you can still be successful, but it takes very different skills than it took, 10 years ago. Like, I feel like, and I'm only setting you up.
No, go ahead.
I'm not stealing your answer, but I do feel like the kydex holster industry is a lot of the same, like, solved problems. And people put their own brand and their own kind of like aspirational lifestyle marketing on top of this simple product that's pretty much the same anywhere you get it. And that's not entirely true, because there are some design features that do make a difference in kydex holsters. But there's a lot of companies out there trying to sell exactly the same thing with just a slightly different like flavoring, like a little pinch of flavor on top. So I think in order to succeed in a holster business now, your skills have to be focused more towards that, like towards the marketing side rather than the product side.
Yeah. So, I mean, the holster space is highly commodified, right? You can get a plain black single clip holster for a Glock 19 on Amazon for $10, right? Is that a market you want to jump into? Right? Knowing what the cost of goods and services to put that on the shelf to sell to a customer, you can't be competing in the commodified space, right? One of the conversations that Andrew and I have once a month is, oh, hey, do you remember so-and-so with that company? Oh yeah, they don't have it anymore. They just kind of stopped.
Yeah,
right?
It's a regular thing to see. There's a couple Facebook groups where, like, every few weeks, you'll see, hey, I'm liquidating my entire,
right.
Anyone want to buy a vacuum form?
I'm selling my business, which consists of, like, 0 IP, zero email list, a handful of, vacuum formers, molds, and shop equipment. And they've been doing it for like 8 to 10 years. And they're like, oh, I just sold my business for 150 grand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, to who? Like, I could go out and buy all that stuff brand new, undepreciated for like 100. Yeah. Right? It's like, so you've got, it's a weird space. So you could start a holster company today. You would have to have an extremely unique selling proposition, and a unique and highly differentiated ability to market.
Yeah, it's almost like it would be harder to jump in at the garage level, but if you had like a what do you call that? I don't know. I'm not the expert at this, but like the business group where everybody helps each other, and like they've got an accountant and they've got marketing pros and they've got if you had those kind of resources to jump you in, you could definitely do it. But I don't really know that the margins are high enough for that type of group to really bother.
Well, it seems like kind of like you're saying, marketing question, and just like maturity of the market, people being aware of it, people like, easily available Kydex holsters becoming a thing, appendix carry becoming a thing. I think where would you be without, like, what did that evolution look like for you in terms of, again, like oversimplifying two theories of evolution of a company. One is like, okay, you just make good products, keep shipping away, and eventually someone will notice and you grow your user base. But I think there are a lot of companies, when you look at their history, you see some like breakthrough product or breakthrough moment that like really jump them off that kind of linear growth path. And then that gets them like a ton of mind share and people are aware of them. And then they can kind of put in more like regular products behind that with that like installed base of users. For you guys, was the Enigma that breakthrough, or even before that, were you like already kind of on the map because you'd been in the market early enough?
Right.
Well, the Enigma caused certain things to happen to us earlier than we expected, right? Prior to Enigma, we had a number of ideas, a number of goals related to the reframing of concealed carry as a process that is much more similar to wearing a prosthetic or an orthotic than it is to anything that people seem to be describing concealed carry as. You're taking this artificial machine and it's an appliance. You apply it to your body. Why are we not taking into consideration any of the totally well-known best practices in, prosthetic and orthotics to cause these things to actually interact with you in an ergonomic way? And so we have been taking a number of deliberate steps in that direction. What happened with Enigma was that it created a particular kind of crisis that we had to respond to as a brand. And that was, we had designed the product with a very specific and narrow segment of minimum viable customer in mind. And
which was who?
Kind of the people that we more or less knew by name or face from, higher yeah. end, like classes we took, right?
I've seen this guy at 6 different classes with national level instructors, and we're on a first name basis.
Right. It's like, I've seen this guy at like 2 or 3 like ShivWorks classes I took, and this is someone.
Why does that guy need an Enigma though? Like, what about him made it a good fit?
That was our customer base originally, and when we decided we wanted to get into the like kind of beltless holster space, that was kind of our brand. It's like we were the brand for that high-end, high-level enthusiast. And so when we launched the Enigma, we, were competing at that point with like the belly band, which typically has no trigger protection. It has no concealment mechanics. It has no retention, and it is a dangerous product. And everyone that we were in communication with knew it. Like, they knew that these products sucked, and nobody took beltless carry really all that seriously.
But it was something that everybody kind of wanted. And we knew that because
Mm-hmm.
the person we partnered with in the design, Jules, had essentially designed this beltless carry system. And our criteria was we can't release a beltless carry system that is not ready to withstand the kind of like entangled gunfight experience that people train for in a like shivworks context. It's like that's the minimum criteria for this. Like if we can't build a beltless carry product that undeniably and demonstrably withstands the most extreme training that people are currently doing in the US as, available to civilians, then we can't bring it to market because our belt holsters do that. We can't move the capability and the expectations down a tier.
Yeah.
Now,
and what? Oh, go ahead.
I was going to kind of move us past that to the idea that when it hit, we underestimated the number of people who wanted that capability.
Yeah, we thought that was like arcane wizardry. Most people don't seem to care about that, but it turns out they do.
Right. It's like we demonstrated, like, here's the level of concealment that you get from the product, and here's the level of performance that you get from the product. We did not accurately judge how large the market was for that. And it immediately saturated the minimum viable customer segment and just sort of like broke out into the wild. And it saturated that minimum segment because we had built it
for them
and catered, and we had assumed that they were going to understand a number of, we knew what their journey to become that customer was. So we assumed a certain amount of prerequisite knowledge and experience. Like we built this for people who had 5 to 10 years of concealed carry experience, took 2 or more major classes a year in the firearm space, and participated in XYZ forums and had the following experiences. So everything we did in regards to the product was completely obvious to them, and the uptake was instantaneous. And now people are seeing, now a much broader audience is seeing the capability and the and identifying that their need for that product, but they don't have the prerequisites. And we were running into a situation where everybody shows up to our dealership and is like, we want to buy that car right now. And then they put down their money, they drive it away, and they come back immediately and they say, this thing is slow and it makes a terrible smell and a horrible noise. And we're like, you bought this car without telling us that you didn't know how to drive stick shift. Okay. So at first we started to like figure out how we were going to like teach all these people how to drive stick shift in the parking lot, because we had the cars and they wanted to buy them.
Yeah, the problem we were having, and the crisis for our brand, is that we had the car, they wanted to buy it, but they would buy it and then they would hate it. They would hate it. And we're like, oh, well, okay, they'd email us and we'd say, okay, do this, this, and this. And they would do the things and they're like, oh, this is amazing. I get it now. Okay, cool. But we couldn't do that one-on-one.
Right. We had to figure out a way where we were going to turn all of those 5 to 10 years of prerequisite holster knowledge that was just taken for granted by our, initial customers, and turn that into a like meme level deliverable that we could saturate the market with, such that people have 5 to 10 years worth of kind of like, the figure out how to make it work for me, fumbling through, buying holsters and figuring out how to make them work for yourselves. How do we turn that into something that someone can learn in an afternoon such that they show up prepared at the moment of purchase to execute all of that with this product?
Yeah, and this was an emergency, and we were panicking about this. However,
all the time.
We also immediately recognized that this was the biggest opportunity that our brand has had ever. That's including the Enigma, because you really only have, you're going to run out of enthusiasts really quick. And the other thing in this industry is the enthusiasts have typically a fairly short life cycle. And you'll see person after person get super, super into shooting for 3 to 5 years, and then, they'll go do motocross. So the life cycle of that enthusiast is relatively short, but we realize we can encounter people earlier in that life cycle, and we can help them be successful sooner. And then who knows what they're going to do? That's so cool for us. It was an incredible opportunity. So even though we were holy cow, how are we going to handle this influx of people who don't know what we know? It wasn't in any kind of way of looking down on the customer for not knowing it. It was
this is stuff that's not being communicated.
Right. And we have the chance to guide their education in kind of an unprecedented way.
Right. The other thing was that in our exploration of okay, how do we educate at scale in this topic, it occurs to us, there's no, transferable set of fundamentals in regards to this process. There's no coherent singular vocabulary here, right? The number of people who know, Jeff Cooper's 4 rules of firearm safety without knowing the name Jeff Cooper or who the hell he was is enormous. And to a certain degree, that's not a problem, right? Because I'm sure that he would agree, he would rather that more people are safe with guns than know his name. And we said, okay, well, we have an opportunity to do something like that here, where we can completely craft from scratch the vocabulary used to describe and implement the process of causing your gun to effectively and sustainably conceal on your body. And we can turn that, we can reverse engineer from what we've done over all these years into a set of fundamentals that you can hand somebody and say, okay, anyone who is accomplishing concealment is doing these, 4 things to some degree or another, right? The same way that everyone who's hitting the target quickly and accurately has, good grip, good trigger press, good sight alignment, good sight picture, and the, implementation of those is going to vary on the individual level, but there's nobody who's shooting at a high level who has bad fundamentals, right? It's just it's kind of tautological, but if you're if you're a fast race car driver, you're not winning races by ignoring the racing line, right? That just does not occur. Right.
Yeah,
it's one
exactly.
of
But if there was no word for the racing line and nobody had ever drawn a map of a racetrack, and all the instruction was, well, just get the race car and see how it feels.
Yeah.
Then that's where you'd be.
Just keep driving different cars until you find one that's fast.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Keep buying guns until you find one that hits the target. Right.
Yeah. Why do you think
so I'm sorry, real quick. So you asked what were the inflection points of our brand, and I think realizing that education was going to be our most valuable deliverable, that was an inflection point for us.
So where do you think, I mean, that's brilliant, but it's not there was no fundamental reason somebody couldn't have sat down. Jeff Cooper couldn't have sat down 40 years ago and mapped out poke and check and peaks and valleys and so on. Why do you think nobody did? And why do you think instead there almost was this kind of counter thing of like, well, if the gun is uncomfortable, something's wrong with you, and dress around the gun and so on.
Yeah.
I know for a fact that the information that we're communicating en masse is extremely common knowledge among a number of holster makers. And
yeah, we didn't
at least
invent it. We just packaged it.
And turn the vocabulary into things that like kind of unpack in your head when you hear it.
Right.
Like poke and check is as simple as, poke and check and peaks and valleys are terms that like you tell somebody them once and they get it. Right. However, all the things regarding concealment mechanics and how to cause a gun to conform to the body in a way that is ergonomic and conceals better. There are a lot of companies, I know for sure, because I have talked to some of them about this, who knew all of this and never communicated it because they didn't want to give away the secret of how their holster was better. Right? People put it on and they go, oh, this is the best one I've ever had. And instead of explaining to them, it's the best one you've ever had because it does the following things and those are necessary for accomplishing concealment. And you can therefore then, fine tune it to your body using those principles. They just they didn't want to broadcast why it was the best holster that somebody had ever had because none of this is proprietary or protected.
Right.
It's just totally discoverable knowledge and information that people just don't talk about because they think that if it's not spoken about, then it somehow lends mystery to why their holster is so good, or that if you talk about why it's so good, then since it's not protected in any way, somebody else can just go and copy it.
Which they do. Which is valid.
For sure. But that happens but that's what happens when you produce things that aren't proprietary or intellectual property.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just the nature of it. Yeah, and that's why you see like a lot of the competing products in the space are like basically like sewn soft goods, and those businesses are just they're dropping like flies because like what are you really going to do that can't be done in Asia for a quarter of the price? So like that kind of stuff, if it's not something that you can protect, then maybe you hope that you just don't talk about it and you get a few more years before someone figures out what you're doing. But yeah, we never really did that. We kind of spilled the secret sauce from the very beginning, because we didn't think that was where our value really, like protecting that information was not necessarily the value of our company. Like we benefit more from sharing it.
And that's reminiscent of how the company started too, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Like, that makes a ton of sense.
I mean, so far we have not gone wrong at all by giving away information that has no fundamental reason for being secret.
Yeah. And a lot of it too is just like trusting our customers. Because I think another thing that kind of happens when you're if you're the only person in your space that knows what you're doing and knows what you're talking about, it's really easy to think that everyone else is too stupid to figure out what you know. So I think another area where we probably deviated from the norm is that we were like, we're not going to dumb down our product. We're going to level up our customer, and we're going to trust them to absorb this information and take what's useful for them and make it work. And they totally have. Like, they totally have. We have people who they will email us and say, hey, I'm about to get my first carry permit and I'm going to go buy a gun. What, do you think I should buy this one or this one? Because you make an Enigma Express for each of those. So like we have people who have not even bought their first gun, but they immediately buy the product, they put it on and they're successful with it because they've absorbed all of the lessons. Yeah. So like those people, like I think the entire market has leveled up some, not that the entire market is exposed to our stuff, but there's definitely a different baseline level of knowledge than there was 5 or 10 years ago. And my very favorite thing in the world is to like go in a Facebook group and just like be a fly on the wall, and I'll see somebody say, "Hey, my holster's printing," and it's like poking me really bad, and I'll go in the comments, and somebody will be like, "Oh, well, you probably need more keel, and yeah, you probably like maybe try a wing and a wedge and do the poke and check," and I'm like, yes, like people are they're self-guiding through this information, they're figuring it out, and then they're passing it down, and I think that is so cool.
Yeah, we also really put a lot of chips on our expectations of people based on how we witness their online interactions. And in a lot of contexts, we see people generate for themselves a huge amount of social capital in, online communities and online micro communities by being helpful and knowledgeable, right? That is a huge kick for a lot of people.
Right.
Like, here's a question for you. Do you remember Metafilter?
Yeah.
Do you remember Ask Metafilter?
No.
Oh, there was a subcategory of Metafilter which was all just like, users asking questions. And you could guarantee that if you asked a particular kind of question, someone would there were like 3 or 4 people within that category who would reliably give you a great answer. Right? And it was and I grew up on that. I was using Metafilter back in the 90s. And
God, we're getting old.
but like you can count on any enthusiast community having some number of people who really like being helpful. And if we can resource those people with an enormous amount of ammunition, which they can use to be helpful, blog posts, videos, content, terminology, systems processes, even if they're not a customer of yours, they will go out there and repeat this information in order to help other people. Now, sometimes you see people in these like online micro communities, they love being a know-it-all, right? That's the other side of that coin. But you resource those people too, and your information spreads. And then if you resource the people who are like genuinely want to be helpful and feel more included in their online community by being helpful, and you give them all the tools they need to be helpful, and it also helps us validate the education. Because it's one thing if Sarah and I can walk someone through the process of really dialing in their concealment. But if we give a total stranger all of the same information and they can reproduce the results on another total stranger who are not connected to us in any way, we know that the process and the fundamentals work because they're repeatable external to us. So that's one of the best things that we like to see, where other people have success with whatever it is they're using because somebody used our information to coach them through it.
Yeah, that's like my absolute favorite part of all of this. I don't even care if it's my holster. I just think that's so cool to see people being successful. And I think we've talked about this in the past, where part of the culture that cares about the Second Amendment, there's on ramps and there's off ramps, and if you're experimenting with concealed carry and your experience is frustrating and lonely and unsuccessful, that's a big off ramp. Maybe you don't carry your gun, and maybe you say, it's really not that important, I guess. Those grapes were probably sour anyway. And that's an off ramp for greater activism. But if this is a place where you can be successful and engaged, and there's a social community, and you can help other people, like that just ties you in a little tighter. And I feel like that is very helpful for the Second Amendment advocate population.
Yeah, I mean, so like going to the range is fun and social. Going to a class is fun and social. Going to a competition event is fun and social. But the actual process of concealed carry is like lonely and frustrating. You don't and you don't share that with anybody.
Right.
And so that should be a context in which there is substantially reduced struggle, right? Because if that is something that is no longer an easy off-ramp, right? if you're not carrying anymore, then you're less likely to shoot competitively because what am I keeping up those skills for? And I'm not going to go to the range as much. And my involvement in the community decreases the more frustration I get with concealed carry.
Yeah, and then it's like, well, maybe I won't write my congressperson about this new gun control bill.
Right.
It's like, yeah, I got other things to do.
But if we can close a bunch of those off ramps by making it something, and even in some cases including a fun and social component to it, like we try to do with our Facebook group, it becomes encouraging, positive, easy, sustainable, and that person might, over time, be more likely to remain a gun carrier, right? And one of the things that we see, I'm sure you'd see it too through activism, is that the gun carriers are a lot more activism than just a lot more active than just the gun havers.
Yeah.
Right. And if we can keep people engaged in the cause and in the community for longer periods of time, then I kind of stop really caring about how many of our holsters they buy as a result of the educational material we put out there.
Yeah, they have a stake in it.
Yeah, it
they have more
grows
of a stake in the community.
The whole pie over a longer period of time.
Right.
Yeah. I really like your Facebook group for that reason. It's one of my favorite.
Oh, that's awesome.
Just kind of like online gun communities because it's kind of friendly and technical. I like the fact that they're, going back to the race car analogy, it's not like, oh, my car is not going fast. And someone's just like, oh, like, drive it better. Right? They're like, no, like, here is the actual reason it's not going fast.
Right.
What do you think?
Mm-hmm. It's like you're braking too early and you need better time.
Exactly. Yeah. What do you think, you can look back at different kind of subcultures that ended up having iconic gathering places. So like Global War on Terror is probably like AR15.com. You can go back on like early VR forums and see Polymer Lucky prototyping just like super early versions of the Oculus Rift. What do you think in 10 years we're going to look back on today as kind of in retrospect the most important gathering places for today's gun culture?
Well, I can tell you that
your Facebook group first and foremost, but other than that,
I mean, aside from that, I mean, YouTube, I guess, generally. But
I think what we will see is whatever examples we come up with, I'd say at least somewhere between 6 and 9 out of 10 of them will have gotten their start in a place like primary and secondary. That's a huge jumping off point for I'd say most people who are doing anything cool now got a lot of their perspective and values and early education and exposure to a lot of concepts through primary and secondary. So like whatever the kind of like whatever is beyond that, that's going to be like the ultimate origin for a lot of stuff. And it's not the biggest or the most popular or even the most active.
But if you think of it like genealogy, you can trace a lot of it back to
right.
that.
That's going to be like the great grandfather of a lot of whatever's happening right now that we will look back on in 10 years. For sure.
Why do you think that is? What distinguishes that?
I think we have to give a lot of credit to Matt Landfair for wrangling a particular kind of group of people together and then keeping them together.
That is like herding cats. It is an impossible task.
Right. Like Matt brought a lot of intelligent, experienced, capable people with extremely strong personalities into one place where a lot of interesting discussion took place. I mean, like, I don't know what the view numbers are on the PNS modcast, but that is going to be a eternal archive of everyone who's currently relevant in the like defensive civilian in the defensive, firearm space, where they have like long unfiltered conversations.
What do you think the next generation of that will be? That's what I wonder, and I'm sure it's in my blind spot because I'm old now and I don't know what the kids are doing these days. But like, I have wondered that because I have a number of blind spots, but I found like I've learned that like a big gateway for people entering the Second Amendment community has been gaming, which is something that I know nothing about. So like, what else is there that we're not exposed to, just due to our kind of, insular generation? And then like, what's the next thing? Like, what is the next ultra enthusiast going to listen to or going to do?
I don't know.
Yeah, it's like things seem to be getting more and more bite-sized. And I don't know what the serious enthusiast will do next.
I don't really know what they're looking at right now, to be honest.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Discord, TikTok, some platform we've never heard of.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there could be a Discord channel that none of us know about.
Yeah.
That's got a lot going on.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of them on Reddit, but there's also a lot of cringe on Reddit too. So
yeah,
like,
but like Reddit isn't a universally high quality space.
No, that's the interesting thing. Like,
and it's
a
also
lot of these
like,
spaces had gatekeeping.
The other thing that's hard to tell is that there's a significant. It's extremely rare to see men and women simultaneously in the same gun related space.
Yeah, that's really
it's super
unusual.
highly segregated.
Yeah.
There might be a venue or community for gun content that 18 to 26-year-old men are highly involved in right now, but it's almost certainly not the same place that 18 to 26-year-old women are involved at all. Like, it's astonishing to us that we have a successful mixed gender firearms related group that hasn't imploded yet at like 35,000 members, 35% of which are women. That is like,
that's super high.
Unbelievable. I don't know of another place like that, so it's hard to say where the enthusiast of the future is going to come from, because women are still the largest growing demographic of gun owners.
Do you do anything deliberate to make that the case in the Facebook group?
No.
Well, I mean, we've got some pretty strict rules, like, don't objectify each other's bodies in the comments, and don't DM people unsolicited.
I think that's like basic decency stuff, like that you must have in order to have a mixed gender space. But we don't like cultivate it in any way. But we also like try to make it a comfortable place, kind of for everyone. But yeah, that's a really interesting question, because we've discussed this. I don't know let's see how much time we have left. Okay, I don't want to get into a whole nother rant.
Go for it.
But there's an interesting dynamic in the firearms industry in general, where if your product is seen as being for women or mostly used by women, that it must be a fundamentally unserious product. And I think that's not unjustified. Historically, a lot of the products made for women have been fundamentally unserious. The typical trajectory for that is a woman will enter the concealed carry space and stay there for about 5 minutes and say, well, I couldn't find anything that met all my needs, so I made this. And then I made this for you. And you're like, oh, that's dangerous. So that's a very typical thing that you'll see. And so the stereotype isn't wrong.
Yeah, unfortunately, some of the products which demonstrate the lowest expectation of women carriers are made by other women.
Yeah.
It's like really, really kind of disappointing.
Right.
And,
I think.
Oh, also like, and the spaces, right? So there's. I think it's safe to assume that like we all are familiar with the various toxicities of internet forums and cultures, right? And there's a divide in toxic male gun groups and toxic female gun groups. The divide is in a toxic male gun group, you will get told that you suck and that you should leave. If you're anything other than the most elite operator, right? And in women-based gun-related groups, there's a like intense toxic positivity where there's like no standards for accomplishment whatsoever.
The way that looks is like in a men's group, you will get relentlessly bullied because you have the wrong light on your gun. In the women's group, if somebody says to you, hey, maybe you should have some trigger protection on that holster and maybe you shouldn't muzzle sweep your baby, that person will get relentlessly bullied for having the audacity to criticize. It's like, no, this isn't criticism. I genuinely don't want you to shoot your baby.
Please don't shoot your baby. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, or like don't put your gun in a purse without a holster.
Yeah, so
or your kid can get.
It's the similar side of the same social dynamic, but just like applied really differently. And that's kind of interesting. But just flipping back real quick to the products, I think one of it's not that there are no good products that are made for women. It's definitely not the case. And the best example that I can give you is the flashbang bra holster. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a holster that attaches to the centerpiece of your bra, and then you draw by pulling down. And when this is a product that is not the typical trajectory of like, nothing worked for me, so I made my own. Not that. It was someone who had been around for a minute and said, hey, I think I can solve a problem that no one else has solved well. And then took that product and rigorously tested it and put it through, ShivWorks classes and did all of the homework. And if you look outside of the small, clueful cell of women in that space, that product gets just as much hate, if not more, than the legitimately dangerous, untested products. So it's like...
And I think I've run into Lisa Looper, the owner of Flashbang, at like the last 3 major training conferences we've been to.
Right.
She's a serious person.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't see the lethal lace holster people at classes. Like, it's not a coincidence. But the perception of these businesses, even though they have done the work, they've done the homework, they still are considered fundamentally unserious products by people who haven't even bothered to know what they're about. So, like, that's a big obstacle for brands like us, because we didn't make this product for women. It's nothing about it is specific to your genitals. Like, it doesn't matter at all. Even talking about like body types, it doesn't matter. So even though we didn't make it for women, the fact that our Facebook group with 35% women, if you look at the group analytics, like 8 out of 10 of the most prolific posters are women. So if somebody comes into that group, they're like, well, it's a lot of women in here talking about women's things. Like, well, this must not be a serious product. Well, I'm out. So it's an interesting dynamic. And then the other thing that goes along with that is our brand has women in positions of leadership and power. So like that alone turns a lot of people off from taking us as a serious brand. So I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. It's annoying, but we're not going to change anything. Like, we're not going to go hire a figurehead man to go do like, be our male influencer. Like, we're not going to do that.
Maybe like you're saying, there is kind of a historical hangover of when products, when a gun product for women just meant that, like, okay, we painted it pink and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's kind of the history there. And so I think the example I always think of here is like Tesla, right? Like when they came out with the Model S, they said, like, our goal is not to make a car that is good for an electric car. Our goal is to make a good car, period.
Yeah, right.
And it's sort of the same thing where, like, you know, you're not making a product that, like, a women's product, or even a product that is like, maybe, yes, it is incidentally better for women, but like the goal is, that's not the goal. The goal is to make a good product. And what falls out of that is, oh, okay, like, it's good for people who weren't in the community before, or like didn't have products that worked for them before. So I think maybe like it sounds like that's something that, as that kind of historical hangover fades, then that that stigma would go away, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on, because it wasn't made for women, but it wasn't made not for women. It's just made to be a good product. It happens to solve a lot of problems that are really strongly tilted towards the women's market, like carrying clothing that doesn't have belt loops. That's, it's easy to go through a week, 7 days of wearing cargo pants with belt loops. And like, if you're a man, that's very typical. For women, your outfit might be completely different. Like, you might one day have low-waisted leggings, and then the next day you have a high-waisted skirt. So, like, it solves a number of problems well. And I think that's why it became so popular with women. But yeah, that was our goal too, is just make a good holster.
Yeah, well, I mean, so it occurred to us that belts don't really have anything to do with bodies, and pants don't really have any, like, a gun belt is the characteristics and the shape, the dimensions of a gun belt are primarily dictated by pants, not by guns and not by bodies, right? Pants don't have anything to do with a gun. So why are we putting a gun, which is not shaped like our body, onto a belt, which isn't shaped like our body, onto pants, which don't expect to have guns attached to them, in holsters that are also shaped like guns, right? Like, but if you go back to first principles and say, we're going to design a holster and a way to carry it around the interaction between guns and bodies as its primary focus, right? And we do this from, like, much more first principles way, rather than, oh, we're going to attach it to, like, rather than bundling all the assumptions, all the unexamined assumptions about, like, belts and pants and guns and how we carry them, right? Like, oh, we just put guns on our belts because belts have always been there. And, like, we've been putting stuff on our belts since somebody put a flint knife and a piece of rope, right? Like,
right.
Not because there's, like, a process or a set of first principles here. It's just, 100,000 years of human inertia. But once we say, okay, we're going to design this around the interaction between the gun and the body as the primary consideration, you stop having, when we look at the, tens of thousands of people in our inbox sharing pictures of how they're concealing so we can help them, and then the people in the workshop group, most people are shaped pretty similarly, right? You start to get deviations in human shapes towards the tails of the shape and size distribution. But when it comes to incorporating the gun into the body, a lot of male and female considerations are highly overlapping, right? Their attire might be substantially divergent, but we haven't found that this particular set of principles, fundamentals, does not work on this body type. They might need dramatically more of any one of these seasonings in order to taste it.
Mm-hmm.
But it'll still be pizza at the end, right? Like,
that's why I laughed when we first came out with the Enigma. I'm like, strong enough for a man, pH balanced for a woman. I'm dating myself, but yeah, like, it's the same. And that little marketing slogan, like, really, how is my pH balance different? I don't know. But that marketing slogan is like a perfect example of this phenomenon of human nature, especially women do this a lot, and I'm sorry for us, but like, oh, well, I'm not going to listen to you because what could you possibly know about concealing on a woman's body? Well, it's a body. They're all kind of, they're not the same, but they all kind of follow the same path.
Right. And like if the principles, if you have come up with kind of a rule book or a set of principles that only work on a particular subset, that's actually not a very good set of principles, right? Like the best rules are generalizable.
Yeah.
I think that's the most valuable thing from my perspective about like the education you guys do and the community you build is that feedback loop. I think for decades, right? Like that feedback loop was just not there. It's in the holster space and in the carry space, where if customers were saying like, hey, this gun does not work on me, or this is uncomfortable, or I don't want to get a different pair of pants, or I don't want to size up, like the answer from the industry was, oh, well, there's something wrong with you, right?
Yeah.
Like,
or you're
it's
just
not supposed to be comfortable. It's supposed to be comforting, right? Like,
Yep.
and I think that feedback loop of like, okay, actually, we are going to treat that that pushback from users or potential users, we're going to treat that as like product development input and like a technical problem to be solved, not a a flame war to be won.
No, it's like people,
that's super valuable, right? Like that's how you make good stuff.
Experience to suck, and it shouldn't.
And no, absolutely not. And it kind of ties back to your previous point about like, was this evolution just like the right time and it was going to happen, no matter who did it? And I think that's a really good point, because at no point in the previous, say 10 years, would we have necessarily had access to a media platform like Facebook, where you can easily share photos, you can easily have threaded like discussions, and it's immediate feedback to 35,000 people. Obviously we started with 1,200. So it didn't start out at 35,000, but it gave us access to this learning lab, and
that's super interesting.
Saw it that way rather than seeing it. So like, we started doing it because Jon had the very brilliant idea of, we can't keep up with the number of customer support emails we're getting from people who hate this product. So how are we going to help them?
Let's phrase that differently. A lot of the people in our inbox had a number of similar struggles,
right,
that were easily solvable. Now, when you get a customer support email from one person, you reply to one person,
mm-hmm.
right? And you can make an FAQ and you can generate content about that, but they need to take like a positive action towards, viewing it, right? Like, yeah. I can't tell you how many times for years in the early days, I would hide our contact email at the bottom of the FAQ, and people would still email me questions that were answered in the FAQ that they skipped.
You've scrolled past the answer.
Right, you scroll past the answer.
Send me this email.
Right.
But if we were going to get a lot of the same questions,
yep,
it made so much more sense to answer these questions completely in the clear with an audience of other people who are either haven't purchased the product yet, and seeing this Q&A will preempt them from having a problem, or somebody who's having an issue who gets to receive the benefit of observing the interaction.
Yeah. Every time somebody posts in the workshop, like, hey, I'm having this problem, there's always comments, oh yeah, me too. So it's really helpful. And I'm not saying like everybody hates the product. I'm saying that when people don't have success with the product immediately, it's a negative experience, and it is a net negative for the brand. So the better we get at kind of like not preventing, but like leveling people up before they even get to us, the
inoculating against failure.
Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it. Yep.
Yeah.
The better that is for us. And that group gave us kind of an unprecedented opportunity to do that publicly. And just the nature of it is like everybody knows they're there to share. So it's not like, it's not like we could take photos from the inbox and like, all right, here's Joe from Montana and here's the problem he's having. We're not going to do that. But in a community space where everybody is there to share with the community, it works really well. So
yeah, I really like that idea of, social media as manufacturing technology, or like key manufacturing input. That's what do you, on the flip side of that, okay, so like that enables a cool new product. It enables people to learn how to use that product and make it work for them.
And it enables us to see what learning techniques work best for people, like what phrasing works best, what images work best. How do we mainline that information to them?
It also develops, trust in the brand and purchasing confidence in the customer as well, too. So that helps a lot, too.
What products or ideas about carry do you think it kills? Like, are there types of holsters? I don't know. I'm thinking of like small of back, or like stuff people like to beat up on the internet, or even just like ideas about carry. Is there stuff that was popular for a while that maybe in the last 5 years this sort of community has revealed are actually destined for the graveyard?
So the one that leaps out to me is that there is an increasing vocal rejection of holsters that you attach to the interior surfaces of your automobile.
Oh, thank God, not even
I can't wait.
Soon enough.
I can't wait for those to die and to go away. I can't tell you how many pictures I've seen of people who have just like drilled a holster into the underside fascia of the steering wheel right next to the panel that says SRS on it, where the knee airbag is going to deploy, right? And it's like there's not a single panel inside of that car that is going to withstand the amount of inertia that the mass of the pistol will transmit to it in an automobile collision. There's no magnet that is strong enough to retain the gun in a collision that will still allow you to access it readily.
Right.
And all of them dramatically increase the occurrences of unnecessary gun handling in a confined space. And just like the rate of accidents associated, like accidents and theft associated with having a separate holster that you put your gun in when you get in the car is really high. And I think that shout out to the tag group, your vehicle is not a holster.
Yeah, they're doing the Lord's work in there.
But I see a lot less of that. And I think one of the things that we're pretty good at doing is obviating some of the perceived necessity of those things by having a holster that just kind of fits you, and you don't have to take your gun off when you get in the car. Because
was that just like a problem with holster comfort, basically? Like,
I think it is tough with especially with strong side holsters or behind the hip type holsters. Like, they're not comfortable to sit on for 6 hours if you're driving.
Yeah, or like particular kinds of like very bolstered automotive seats suck for carry.
Yeah, but I mean, like, in the modern era with not everybody will be successful with this, but most body types with a properly set up appendix carry holster will have a very comfortable time in the car. So you don't need to take it off, which is great. The other thing I've seen, which makes me so happy, is like 5-10 years ago when I was I've always kind of hung out in the women's online groups. And 5 or 10 years ago, you'd see a ton of belly bands, you'd see a ton of sticky holsters, you'd see all these things that are just, they fail the basic safety criteria that any holster should have. And you never used to...
Leggings.
Yeah, leggings that you just shove your gun in the leggings. That's a great idea. They're elastic. It'll be fine. But all that stuff was widely proliferated, and there was really no criticism of it. And the change that I've seen in the last 5 years is that now if you post a belly band holster, someone will be in the comments like, how does it protect the trigger? Like, do you have a trigger guard in it? What kind of trigger guard? Oh, you don't? You should have one, definitely. Like, so that has changed. And it's not everywhere. Some groups are better than others, but I think it's a tide. And I've definitely seen some movement, and I'm really happy to see that.
Something you guys have said to me and the other OSD people a few times in the past when we talk about community building is nobody goes to the anti-gun range.
Yes. Real quick, that quote is from Tamara Keel, and it always gets attributed to us. So we didn't.
Okay.
Yeah.
She's an absolute genius, and she has like 1,000 witty turns of phrase like that. But
Tamara Keel's the handgun editor at Shooting Illustrated and at Recoil.
Yep, and her blog is View from the Porch.
Yeah.
But
okay.
Anyway.
Shout out to Tamara Keel for a memorable turn of phrase. Nobody goes to the anti-gun range. So the idea there is like, if we're trying to spread gun ownership, gun rights, gun culture, we have the advantage of it just being fun.
Yeah,
like it's a lot easier to spread something fun than something that's not fun. I think the devil's advocate on that is guns are scary if you are unfamiliar, right? Like I've taken a lot of people to the range for their first time, and if they didn't grow up around it, just the physical presence of a gun is disconcerting emotionally.
Yeah.
For a bit, they get over it, but that's a hurdle. For people who are starting to carry, what is kind of the analogous thing? Is it the, help, I'm appendix carrying for the first time and there is a gun pointed at my genitals or my femoral artery? What are kind of those hurdles that your customers have to navigate when they're new?
That's a big one. And all of these things are I tell people all the time that if your instincts are telling you something's wrong, you should listen. That should be the first step. Because a lot of times you'll hear somebody say, oh, well, I don't know, I don't feel safe carrying with a round in the chamber because, what if the gun goes off? And everyone will jump down their throat and say, well, if you're not carrying with a round in the chamber, you're not even ready to carry at all. What are you even doing here? But that's the wrong approach. You don't make people better self-defenders by gaslighting them out of their valid concerns. You make them a better defender by giving them the skills and the knowledge to understand what they're doing and feel comfortable with it.
Yeah, that person is expressing something true about their confidence level.
Skills or confidence is earned. It's not, you don't just willpower yourself into being confident. And if you do, you're dangerous. So confidence is one of those things where okay, you earn it through developing the skills and the technical knowledge to understand what you're doing. So flipping back to empty chamber carry, and here I'm going to shout out to Annette Evans and Kathy Jackson, who are two fundamental people in the women's concealed carry and self-defense space, because both of them have really evolved my thinking on this. But if somebody says, I don't feel comfortable carrying with a round in the chamber, first question should be, why is that? And when you start asking why instead of just jumping down their throat, all of a sudden you'll find things like, well, I put my gun in the holster and then it fell out in the Walmart bathroom and it was really embarrassing. Like, you're right. You should not be carrying that gun loaded because your holster doesn't have safe retention. You're right. Or they'll say something like, well, the holster's kind of like this soft elastic and I can see the trigger through the elastic, so I just don't feel like it's really well protected. And you're like, you're correct. That trigger is not well protected and you were right. So a lot of times there's a gear related reason why they don't feel comfortable. And sometimes it's knowledge. So sometimes they don't understand that if the holster meets all the requirements of a holster, it'll retain the gun, it'll protect the trigger, and it allows you to safely reholster. Then when you insert the gun into that holster, it's basically inert. So it is neutralized. So where it's pointed inside the holster doesn't particularly matter until you take the gun out. Now you're handling it and all the handling rules apply. So I
had another thought.
Yeah, no, I was just going to tie it all together real quick and say that, so those those are probably the two biggest like discomfort points we find for new concealed carriers.
There's a third.
Oh, go ahead. What's your third?
The third is everyone can see my gun. Oh my God, it's so obvious.
Right.
and
That's a good one too.
the avenue by which people jump down their throats is nobody's paying attention to you anyway. They are all buried in their phones, and printing doesn't matter because nobody knows and nobody cares. That's, first of all, just an assertion. Secondly, we're not carrying guns because of all the people who have their heads buried in their phones. We're carrying guns because of the people who are walking around looking for prey. It's like saying, oh, you don't need stealth aircraft because nobody's looking at the sky. Right. Well, we do, because the people who are looking at the sky are looking for exactly what we're trying to fly over them. Right. Like, I don't carry a gun because of, like the oblivious people at the Cracker Barrel, So it's a reasonable concern. I feel conspicuous, and people give advice like, just keep carrying, you'll get over it.
Yeah.
But people don't develop confidence, like Sarah said, through sheer force of will. You develop confidence by habituating success and control over outcomes, right? I successfully controlled these outcomes in 10 different instances. Therefore, I have confidence I'll be able to do the 11th, right? So when you give people a process that they can follow, over which they can be confident and say, I am in control over the visibility of my pistol because I followed these principles and I did these steps and I got these results. And every time I change my clothing, I can repeat those steps in order to get that outcome in this attire and in that attire and in this context and that context. I'm in control over the visible signature of my pistol. Therefore, I'm no longer concerned about how conspicuous I am. Right? Not, well, I just don't care. I've just willed myself into not caring because of the happenstance of the fact that nobody's paying attention, but the people who matter are. But also, you don't want to be surprised by them detecting you, right? So, it's a legitimate concern.
Yeah,
that, it's like, the concern acknowledges that yes, consequences exist for being detected, and I don't want those, right? Like, whether 9 out of the 10 people you run into in a given day are consequential or not isn't the issue. It's that the consequences exist. Yeah. Consequences for detection exist regardless of any other factor, and you can control the detection and therefore reduce the consequences. And people want that, and they don't want to get there by having to risk consequences until they're desensitized to it. They want to be in control of the amount of potential detection.
Yeah, I think as a community overall, we generally do a disservice to people who have concerns about any aspect of concealed carry. Whether it's where is it pointing? Is there a round in the chamber? Am I well concealed? And somebody with a completely different context will jump in and tell them that they're wrong and an idiot. And it's like, yeah, me in rural Wyoming, I don't care if I'm printing because I'm on the first name basis with the sheriff and I know everybody that lives in a 12-mile radius. Like, I don't care. we all have guns and we go shooting together. But somebody says, well, I'm afraid that I'm printing. And you're like, really? Where do you live? Oh, wow, I'm in San Francisco. Okay.
Right. Or
that's
like,
different.
we're in post brew in New York, and I've got to take the train from, Staten Island to, I've got to, take the ferry from Staten Island to Manhattan and then take the subway to work. And I'm going to walk past 7,500 strangers on my way to work.
Mm-hmm.
I do not want to be detectable. Well, yeah, you can't tell that person that nobody notices that you're printing. Yeah. You're going to tell me that not a single one of those 7,500 people that you interacted with or were in the presence of on your way to work noticed you?
We have like a kind of like real close to home example for a lot of folks is we've had folks who have contacted us for help due to like a domestic violence situation where like, okay, I need to conceal right now. And by the way, every Sunday when I go to church, I'm up on stage in front of the entire congregation. And my concealment needs to be good enough to withstand 200 eyes on me for the next hour and a half. Yeah. Like, these contexts are all so different, but it's like just a couple questions, really, and you can get to the root of like, okay, what's the root of this concern? Yeah, you're right about that, and let's give you the skills to address it.
I really like it kind of goes back to the same way of like debugging comfort issues, as these are ultimately skills, and it's sort of the same of like debugging emotional issues by being like, no, this is a skill issue, and skills are learnable. I heard a parenting podcast recently where they were talking about this idea of like punishing kids for emotional outbursts, and if they're very young, they may not have the skills to handle like a particular emotion or frustration. So the analogy they gave was, well, if your kid didn't know how to swim and you threw them in the pool and they started drowning, you wouldn't take them out of the pool and say, go to your room until you know how to swim.
Yeah.
Right. And I think exactly. That's the way when people have either comfort issues or emotional concerns or like kind of fears about carrying, that's the way the community treats people sometimes, is like, all right, like go to your room until the gun is comfortable. It's like, no, this is like, we can break the physical world down into a series of steps that we can learn, right? Yeah. Like these are learnable systems.
90% of the time when somebody has a comfort issue, there is a corresponding concealment problem too. Right?
Yeah, and I was going to say real quick, again, nod to Kathy Jackson for this, but when we punish people for like not having the skill or not having the knowledge, the other thing we're doing, and this is like way more insidious, we're actually diminishing their ability to protect themselves. So, for example, if you tell someone your gut instinct about this is wrong and you should listen to me, the authority figure, you're actually setting them up to be more easy to victimize later in life, because now you've conditioned them to ignore their emotional response and respond to this authority figure like some dude on the internet like you have any authority. But like that over time erodes people's ability to set boundaries and defend themselves. And you're doing it at a time when they're brand new to this world and they're just exploring even the idea of setting boundaries. So like the biggest service you can do for your, if you're an instructor for your students, is to respect their boundaries, because they shouldn't, like, the foundation of your class or your advice or whatever it may be, it shouldn't be like predicated on this foundation that they submit their correct gut instincts to your authority.
That is a great note to end on. Where can people go to stay up to date on what you're doing?
You can find us at PHLsterHolsters.com, on YouTube at PHLster, and the PHLster Concealment Workshop Facebook group. Those are the three best places.
Okay. Yeah, and thank you so much for your time. This was a great discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
We haven't got to sit down and do one of these in a little while.
Yeah, it's been a bit.